Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Rudolf Sprenger, Bolshevism, its roots, role, class view, and methods. Rudolf Sprenger was a pen name of Helmut Wagner, the council communist. The title of this chapter is Bolshevism and the Worker. First section, a working class party? Zinoviev well described the attitudes taken by the revolutionary intelligentsia of Russia toward the proletariat of their country when Zinoviev observed that the student youth of 1900, seeking to find a mass power, quote, by which to overthrow the Tsarist autocracy, convinced themselves with every step they took that the working class was the force holding the hammer that could be used to smash Tsarism, end quote. Parenthesis, History of the Communist Party of Russia, page 66, in parenthesis. The Russian social democracy arose outside of the proletariat. Lenin assigned to the Social Democratic Party the task of becoming the, quote, ideological leader, end quote, of the proletariat, whose class struggle it was to, quote, support, end quote. He wrote in 1897, quote, if the army of the proletariat proves itself to be consequent and the army of the proletariat struggles under the leadership of a strong democratic organization for the army of the proletariat's economic and political liberation, then the army itself will show to the generals the methods and means of action they must use, end quote. Lenin. The Social Democratic generals were expected to learn some things from the proletarian army under their command, but they were nevertheless going to remain generals. And generals the Bolsheviki always felt the Bolshevikis selves to be. Lenin wrote in 1901, quote, the working class is already in motion. The working class is prepared to follow the socialist leaders, but the, quote, general staff, end quote, has not yet succeeded in organizing a strong body of picked troops who would correctly dispose of all the existing forces of the class-conscious workers, end quote. Expressing itself even more to the point than the, quote, old man, end quote, a provincial social democratic committee of the time declared in its table of principles, as is reported by Akselrod, quote, inasmuch as under present conditions a forcible overturn in Russia can only be accomplished with the aid of the proletariat and of our large industrial centers, and the latter is ready to obey, and begin the uprising, we consider our most important task to be the organization of the working class, end quote. I'm trying to find who that quote was. It says, a provincial social democratic committee of the time declared its table of principles. This is reported by Akselrod. In his party history, Zinoviev notes the following concerning the revolution of 1905, quote, ... there was on hand a body. It was necessary to stick on it a head. The party therefore had to mingle with this mass in order to take in tow this mass's general movement and conduct this mass's general movement on the historic road of the working class, end quote. Zinoviev. And we finally have the utterance of Stalin himself, who, discoursing on the problems of Leninism, writes, quote, the party is the general staff of the proletariat, end quote. Stalin. Already in 1897, Lenin noted that the role of the intelligentsia made, quote, superfluous the presence of outstanding intellectual leaders in the parenthesis labor and parenthesis movement, end quote. Lenin meant to say that Lenin did not want to have the, quote, intellectual leadership, end quote, segregated within the social democratic organizations, but thought that these leaders had to make some connection with the workers. This problem especially engrossed Lenin's attention during the Iskra period, when his ideas on party organization took shape. Lenin pointed out at that time that the, quote, material elements, end quote, of a spontaneous movement had, quote, grown enormously, but the, quote, goal-conscious leaders, end quote, the Social Democrats, were not quite abreast of the times. Quote, the spontaneous mass movement lacks, quote, ideologists, end quote, with sufficient theoretic preparation to be safe from any deviation. It lacks leaders with enough scope of vision, enough revolutionary energy, and organizational talent to create a political party that could function on the basis of the new movement, end quote. Lenin. And Lenin wrote in 1902, quote, the movement must be led by as small as possible a number of as similar as possible groups composed of experienced and tried professional revolutionists. There must participate in the movement as large as possible a number of as varied and multifarious as possible groups representing the different strata of the proletariat, end quote. Lenin. The, quote, whole art of conspirative organization, end quote, it consisted, according to Lenin, in, quote, making use of each and all, end quote, quote, in giving work to all and each, end quote, but at the same time maintaining leadership over the entire movement, end quote. The professional revolutionary conspiratorial organization had to maintain itself above the struggling mass and lead it. Developing this idea in opposition to Trotsky at the Party Congress in London, Lenin said, quote, the party must be the vanguard, the leader of the broad mass of the working class. The latter acts entirely, parenthesis, or almost entirely, end parenthesis, quote, under the control of the leadership, end quote, of the party organizations, which, however, do not at all belong, nor need to belong to the party, end quote. Lenin. After the Party Congress, Lenin declared that the, quote, entire class, end quote, must act under the leadership of the party and be brought as close to it as possible. Quote, not the party should envelop the conspiratorial organization, but the revolutionary class, the proletariat, must envelope the party, which contains in itself the conspiratorial as well as the non-conspiratorial organizations, end quote. Lenin. The party that Lenin wanted to create was to be a conspiratorial, quote, leader, end quote, organization, which, with the aid of the, quote, professional revolutionists, end quote, would fashion a wide net of party organizations, ranging from, quote, the narrowest and most conspiratorial kind to the broadest and most to the broadest and least conspiratorial, end quote. Lenin. The, quote, masses were to, quote, cover up, end quote, envelope the party. The party center as the general staff, the local committee as officers, the party membership as the lower rank officers, the mass of workers as the army acting under the command of this military political apparatus. That's all in italicized. The party center as the general staff, the local committee as officers, the party membership as the lower rank officers, the mass of workers as the army acting under the command of this military political apparatus. That is the organizational picture of the Bolshevik Party, a picture that discloses the peculiar relation of the Bolsheviki to the working class. The Bolsheviki's party was a workers' party only in the sense that it wanted to put the mass of workers under its orders. The Bolsheviki Party was a workers' party only in the sense that the Bolshevik Party wanted to put the mass of workers under the Bolshevik Party's orders. New section. The role of the worker in the Bolshevik Party. In 1905, Lenin set himself energetically to the task of bringing workers into the party organization. Lenin attacked the limited activity of the party, quote, committees, end quote, and warned that the party would collapse unless new organizations were created. The, quote, committees, end quote, arose as a result of the peculiar manner in which the work of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was carried on. Up to 1903, there existed in the party a definite separation between the intellectuals and workers. As we read in the report of the Russian delegation to the International Socialist Congress of 1904, quote, we read in the report of the Russian delegation to the International Socialist Congress of 1904, quote, in accordance with the distinction drawn between the, quote, workers' committees, end quote, and the, quote, intellectuals' committees, end quote, the first merely had the function of acting as executive organ for the latter, end quote. In other words, the workers in the Russian Social Democratic Party were considered to be the political handymen of the revolutionary intelligentsia. It was especially because of this that the social democracy of Russia was not able to keep up with events in 1905. According to Martov's testimony, the great number of Russian workers stayed away from the social democratic organizations because they were not allowed there to have an equal say with the intellectuals. As a result, the workers preferred their trade organizations where they had wide opportunities for self-activity and found themselves in the current of the immediate class movement. The more obvious this became, the more Lenin stressed to his party the need of a change of method in dealing with the workers. Thus he wrote in a letter to Bogdanov and Glusev that, quote, all those who permit themselves to argue that there is, quote, nobody, end quote, there, parenthesis, in the workers' trade organizations, end parenthesis, should be stood up against the wall, end quote, Lenin. Lenin demanded that the social democracy create a new channel for the, quote, new currents of the social movement, end quote. For every delay served the enemies of the social democracy. The new currents sought a way out. If they did find the social democratic channel, they would flow into a non-social democratic channel. If they did not find the social democratic channel, they would flow into a non-social democratic channel. In this manner, Lenin developed the theory that there could be no conscious proletarian mass movement without the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The mass of workers were politically blind. If the social democracy possessed a big enough apparatus, it could possess itself of the great current of the workers' movement. Otherwise, the latter would be drawn away by other forces into a different channel. In any case, the workers' mass was the object of any, quote, leader, end quote, organization that was conscious of its goal. Only the latter, the intellectual leaders, could be conscious of a goal. This was the significance of Lenin's demand in the autumn of 1905 for the, quote, party education of the proletariat and the union of the proletarian vanguard with an effective political party, end quote. Lenin was quite dissatisfied with the results of the work done by the social democratic organization up to then. Lenin said there was the need of having workers in the Bolshevik organization. Why? Well, without the workers, the Bolshevik leaders could not, for conspirative and psychological reasons, come in direct contact with the masses. Lenin intended, however, to keep strictly apart, in the new inclusive party organizations, the respective statuses and tasks of the intellectuals and workers. Quote, the intellectuals are good at solving questions, quote, of principle, end quote. Intellectuals are good at drafting plans and supervising the execution of plans, ... The workers busy themselves with the application of gray theory and living practice, end quote. Lenin. In other words, the intellectuals were to continue to be the, quote, leaders, end quote. The workers drawn into the party were to continue to act under the command of the intellectual leaders. This was Lenin's position on the role of the workers in his party. New section. The Revolutionaries' Organization. In his pamphlet, What is to be Done?, Lenin described the difference between political and trade union organizations as a difference between, quote, revolutionary, end quote, organizations and, quote, worker, end quote, organizations. Lenin said that no distinction was to be made between workers and intellectuals, but since the party, quote, had to consist primarily, end quote, of persons, quote, whose profession was revolutionary activity, end quote, Lenin excluded the workers as definite and direct agents of party activity. It was 10 times easier for an intellectual than for a worker to become a professional revolutionary. The worker was literally torn out of his class milieu when, quote, chosen, end quote, by the party. So that in practice, Lenin tore up the unity he had emphasized in his organizational draft and allowed the workers a second-ranked place in his party. In One Step Forward, in the piece One Step Forward, Two Backwards, Lenin classified all organizations in accordance with the following categories, ranking them by their composition and the degree of their, quote, conspirativeness, end quote. Quote, 1. The Revolutionaries' Organization. 2. The Workers' Organization. The Workers' Organization should be as broad and varied as possible. Parenthesis, I limit myself here to the working class, but it's understood that under certain conditions these organizations may include elements from other classes, end parenthesis. The former categories from the party. Further removed are 3. The worker organizations that stand near the party. Then 4, those worker organizations that do not stand near the party, but submit themselves to the party's control and direction. And finally 5, the unorganized elements of the working class, which submit themselves to the direction of the social democracy, at least at important movements of the class struggle, end quote. Lenin. Here too Lenin put the, quote, revolutionaries, end quote, organization above the, quote, workers, end quote, organization. The two party categories did not have the same value for Lenin. By providing for such, quote, categories, end quote, in his party, Lenin was really expressing again his principle of the, quote, leadership, end quote, of the intellectuals. By permitting certain workers to enter his party, Lenin wanted to lay hold, through the workers, of those workers who belonged in the remaining categories of his organizational scheme, merely, quote, submitted, end quote, themselves to the direction offered by the social democracy. There was no question for him of the equality of the workers and intellectuals. Such an idea is alien to Bolshevism. The provision for the mentioned 5 ranks in Lenin's plan shows that the workers who were included in the Bolshevik organization, parenthesis, subordinated there, of course, to the professional revolutionaries, end parenthesis, were taken in because they were technically indispensable in the business of manipulating the outside mass. They were admitted into the party because there was a technical need for them, and not because they as workers were meant to determine by their membership the political physiognomy of the party. According to Lenin, the revolution of his organization scheme would be the realization of a, quote, proletarian principle, end quote. The disagreement that arose over the first paragraphs of the supposed statute on party organization and led to the split of the Russian social democracy in 1903, Lenin described as a conflict between, quote, adherents of bourgeois intellectual individualism, end quote, and, quote, adherents of proletarian organization and discipline, end quote. Lenin. Those are clever words. The fact is that theoretically the Mensheviks represented the organizational principles of the Western social democracy, while Lenin, though he played shrewdly with such terms as, quote, proletariat and, quote, bourgeois intellectual, end quote, stood for the organizational principle that is typical of the radical bourgeoisie, the organizational principle of Jacobin revolutionism. The problem of, quote, leadership, end quote, which worried Lenin's, quote, Labor Party, end quote, was not that of drawing the best forces of the proletarian class into political activity. The important question for Lenin and Lenin's party was, parenthesis, as stated in What is to be Done, end parenthesis, the substitution of, quote, good leaders, end quote, for, quote, bad leaders, end quote. The working class could be influential in bringing about a political decision only if the working class submitted itself to the, quote, good, end quote, leaders. Therefore, the constant talk of the party was to convince the mass of the, quote, correctness, end quote, of party policies, not the development of the independent will and self-consciousness of the proletariat, but the, quote, persuasion, end quote, of the proletariat is the ideological working principle of Bolshevism, from Lenin to Stalin, from Trotsky to Brandler. That's a reference to Heinrich Brandler, who's an important right opposition figure in Germany. The struggle over the, quote, masses, end quote, has always been for Bolshevism a struggle against the competition of, quote, bad, quote, opportunist, quote, betraying, quote, social fascists, quote, Trotskyist, end quote, leaders who have to be vanquished so that the, quote, leadership, end quote, might fall to the Bolshevik Party. Policy is the business of leaders and leader organizations. They do all the thinking for the mass. Bolshevism does not recognize a proletariat that is capable of developing and executing its, quote, policy, end quote, independently. That's in italics, I'll repeat that. Bolshevism does not recognize a proletariat that is capable of developing and executing its, quote, policy, end quote, independently. It's the end of chapter 4 of Rudolf Sprenger, or Helmut Wagner's book, Bolshevism, Its Roots, Role, Class View, and Methods. Thank you so much for listening. The chapter was titled Bolshevism and the Worker.